Welcome, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me and for all of you as well to be here today to get to know two very eminent and topical writers from two countries that are interesting to watch at the moment, let's say. We have Andreï Kourkov from Ukraine and Jonathan Coe from the United Kingdom. So first, I'll just give you a little background to introduce you to the two writers. They have quite a few things in common. Now, both of them were born in 1961. So they've been around for quite a few interesting phases of recent history. Mr. Coe was born in Birmingham and now lives in London, and has lived in London for 30 years, but he still has this foot in both worlds, not just the capital city center of the universe feeling that people have when they live in a capital city, but he has this awareness of life outside. And his father worked in a job connected to the motor industry. So that's also a theme in Mr. Coe's work, this enormous change that has taken place of the post-industrialized society that we have now compared to in his childhood when these factories were, you know, I don't know if they were working 24 hours a day, but they were enormous and they employed thousands of people, and entire communities were built around factories. So Jonathan, or Mr. Coe, let's say Jonathan, because I'm not going to keep that up, that Mr. thing. It's not going to work. So Jonathan and Andreï both were precocious writers, and we just figured out who wins of the two of them when they started writing, and I think it was Andreï who was 7. Or was it the other way around? And Jonathan was 8. So very creative, imaginative people, and I'm going to try and find out later a little bit about what spurred them to sort of take on this role as the conscience, in a way, or you know, one of the consciences of their nations. So to get back to Jonathan's writing profile, He's published, I think it's 11 books, and the first book he got published in 1987, which was called The Accidental Woman, and so that's not too bad. He was still in his 20s when he got into the writing life, but he also had a passion for music and was in a band for a while, and his passion for music is very evident in his books. There are a lot of references to music in the work. And Andreï at the same time also went to music school for 10 years and is a piano player. So maybe something musical will come out of this meeting of the two writers today. The book that sort of was a breakthrough for Jonathan Coe was What a Carve-Up. It was What a Carve-Up. It was his first international success, translated into 16 languages. And it was a story about the Thatcher years and all the privatization, I think, that went on, or the profiteering that went on. And then there's also a very interesting trilogy of books which can also be read, each one standalone. The Rotters Club, the Closed Circle, and his most recent book, published this year, Middle England. And those books feature the same characters who appear in them, and you can see all the stresses and strains and divisions and frustrations of modern Britain in the lives of these characters. So I'm really looking forward to asking Jonathan Coe more about his books. We have Andreï as well, Andreï Kourkov, who is Russian-born, and yet he's a Ukrainian writer, and it's something that we might forget about Ukraine, that it has this diversity. It has this split as well between ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, and ethnic Ukrainians. And Andreï moved to live in Ukraine as he was born near St. Petersburg, also in 1961, and moved to Ukraine when he was a baby, pretty much. And so a couple of things about his early years. One thing was that he had a cactus collection, which was ranked the 7th largest or best cactus collection in Ukraine as a boy. Oh, sorry, in Kiev only, in Kiev. And his poor parents had to put up with a house full of every spare centimeter covered in cacti. And through the cactus collection, he got interested in botanic language and Latin, and then, you know, developed a love for languages. And he actually studied Japanese, and the KGB had their eye on him as a potential spy, a potential ear to send out to the East to listen to communications in Japan. But he avoided that destiny by volunteering instead to be a prison warden during his military service in Odessa. So Andreï's work, he may be best known in the English-speaking world for the book Death and the Penguin, which came out in 2010 in the English translation, but was the original came out in 1996. And that's just a lovely story about a lonely, sidelined journalist living on his own, who takes in a penguin, which is the zoo is trying to get rid of the animals they can't afford to feed, and so the penguin becomes his companion, and then he ends up getting involved in very ominous working on obituaries that are far from normal obituaries. So a lot of Andreï's heroes are lonely, marginalized figures, but he himself is not a lonely, marginalized figure. He's a very important voice in Ukraine, inside the country and outside the country, explaining it to the world, what's going on. His diaries, what were they called? The Ukraine Diaries, Dispatches from Kiev in 2014, are literally that. I think it's about a year of Andreï's life and impressions and experiences during the time that the Maidan protests were happening, just 500 meters away from his apartment. And so he takes us through all of that crazy time when new precedents were set for the absurd and the unacceptable. There's another book of his which has a resonance with what's happened today in Ukraine with the new president, and it's the president's last love. So there is a new president in Ukraine, Zelensky, who is who was a TV star in a show about a man who accidentally became president, and he played the president. Now he is the president. Andreï's book, The President's Last Love, has a main character who is the president, who has the same date of birth or life trajectory. Well, not the same trajectory, but the same lifetime as Andreï. So it could well have been Mr. Kourkov who became the president instead of Zelensky. Anything is possible. So that's who we're talking to today, and I've already spoken for too long. So I'm going to get the obligatory question out of the way. A question about, because we're discussing political satire in fiction today, starting with Jonathan, would you be able to tell us what your feeling is, as you're known as a political satirist? What is political satire in fiction today?
I don't know. I mean, satire is a word that people use very loosely, in my experience. And in Britain, at any rate, it's become just kind of shorthand for writing about politics, which has a comic dimension to it. any writing about on political or contemporary historical themes with a comic edge gets pigeonholed as satire, including my books. And I think the word becomes a bit meaningless if we use it that loosely. I've always kind of agreed with Milan Kundera, who said that the idea of a satirical novel is actually a contradiction in terms, because satire, the phrase he used about satire was that satire is a thesis art, which tries to direct the reader or the audience, to push the audience into the direction of a certain political philosophy or point of view. A form of art which has its point of view kind of preformed and built in already, and tries to polemicize, to persuade the audience in that direction, whereas he felt that the novel, talking specifically about the European novel, I think was a polyphonic and ambiguous and ambivalent form of writing, where the whole point of the form and the whole glory of the form was its diversity of voices and its diversity of viewpoints. So when I'm talking about my own work, I tend to try to be quite rigorous and categorical about this, because some of my books, I think, are satirical. Some of my books have elements of satire, and some of my books are not satirical at all. You mentioned What a Carve Up at the beginning, which was, as you said, was kind of my breakthrough book into an international audience, and that is a satirical novel. I wouldn't quarrel with that categorization at all, because it's a polemical anti-Thatcherite fable, if you like, comic fable. Whereas I think my more recent books have tried to be more ambiguous, more ambivalent about different political points of view, and often, more sympathetic to points of view that I don't necessarily hold myself. To be equally categorical about my new novel, Middle England, I would say that this is a novel of 45 chapters, and 5 of the chapters are satirical. And those are the ones where you have set-piece dialogues between Nigel, a young political advisor to David Cameron, and Doug, who is a left-wing journalist, and they bat these ideas about Brexit and other things backwards and forwards across the table, and these chapters kind of stand apart in a different genre from the rest of the novel, which has a lot of comedy in it, but it's more the human comedy of everyday social interaction. To me, satire and the novel do not sit very comfortably together, although I've found and continue to try to find ways of making the two sit together and work together, because I like both, and it's kind of an interesting challenge to make two such contradictory modes of expression work together with each other.
Well, please keep that up, because it definitely works for the reader. And we'll come back to Brexit later on. But first of all, Andreï, to talk about the situation in your country, you mention in the Ukraine diaries that the situation there was like a hybrid war, and that Ukraine was critical but stable. And 5 years have gone by since then, and I get the feeling Ukraine is still critical but stable. Has anything changed, or how can you bring us up to date?
Well, you asked Jonathan a much better question, I should say. But okay. Okay, well, in Ukraine, unstable situation is normality. So, what we have today, it's still, it's stable absence of stability to which people adapted. Even those who live on the front line, and I was in January visiting 4 towns on the front line. People get used to everything. What is unusual, of course, the elections you mentioned, which shows that anything can happen, and not only in Ukraine. What happened actually is a person who doesn't have any policy, who didn't produce any ideas, who didn't give interviews during election campaign not to lose voters, became president, which means that actually the society is fed up with all well-known faces of politicians, and they decided to play this game. Actually, I mean, the person was every day during 5 years on TV as a comedian, making fun of Ukrainian politicians and Ukraine as a country. And now I'm looking forward to see the next comedian who will make fun of him. Maybe maybe I will make fun of him. Yes.
Yes, you should. I'm going to. What you just said reminds me of a quote that I wanted to read out from your book, Death and the Penguin, about the most difficult circumstances becoming normality. And the hero Victor, these are his thoughts. All was well, or appeared so, to every time its own normality. The once terrible was now commonplace, meaning that people accepted it as the norm and went on living instead of getting needlessly agitated. For them, as for Victor, the main thing, after all, was still to live, come what might. So my question for you, Andreï, is this what you're fighting against, this dulling of the senses and dulling of the morals?
Well, am I fighting? I mean, I used to think that I'm writing to provoke reactions, sometimes negative reactions. I mean, I never called my novels satirical, but I accept that there are elements of satire, and there are novels where you have politicians as characters. Whenever you have a politics or politician mentioned in the book becomes satirical. Because, I mean, there is no positive image of any politician present in Ukrainian literature. Maybe in Russian, yes, but not in Ukraine. So I mean, Ukraine has enough problems to write about. I mean, the level of morality of the society is one of them. But I mean, the problem is that people who are naturally immoral, usually they don't read books, they watch TV, and they like comedians who make fun of anything else. So here, there is no vacancy for me. So I'm writing for those who understand what is happening, actually. And because they understand it, it like, sometimes writers think that they can influence the society. I feel that I keep my readers sort of sure that they are right. And sometimes try to change their views a bit.
Do you ever, as a satirist or as a novelist, find yourself in this paradoxical position of kind of rubbing your hands at the absurdity of reality and the increasing and spiraling absurdity of reality, because it gives us such great material?
I mean, from the Soviet time, because I mean, I started writing in the Soviet times, and then actually I wrote some satirical short novels which I never published, and they were my reaction to what I saw, and I grew up under influence of my brother, who was anti-Soviet dissident, and we lived in a small apartment, of Khrushchev's era apartment, with a small kitchen and 2 rooms. And the kitchen was the intellectual club. So his friends would come, they would lock themselves inside the kitchen, exchange with the legal literature, some is that, manuscripts and real photographs of the pages, exchange with political and non-political jokes, drink port wine or vodka. And this was the anti-Soviet activity, daily activity of many intellectuals. And I was allowed very often to be present, to listen to the jokes, to read the books, but not to drink vodka, which is good. Yeah, and so I mean, my transitional period from writing poetry to writing prose was the creating of new jokes. Because me and my brother, we participated several times in illegal joke-telling competitions in the Crimea. And once we won 6 bottles of Novy Svet champagne because of my jokes that I developed. And actually, I mean, the easiest way to protest against the Soviet absurdity was to share the jokes. In Stalin's times, actually, you could be imprisoned for the jokes. In Brezhnev's times, you probably would be cautioned, or you would be watched. But I don't know about the prison cases. Practically, any political joke is satire. And actually, the return of jokes, which I can say that after the independence of 1991, the jokes disappeared because, I mean, it looked like they belonged to the Soviet history, but then they came back much later. And now there are some good jokes back, which means that the society is organizing its immune system against the reality. And that's what makes people stable in their minds in the times of stable instability.
Yes, it's a form of therapy, almost. Yeah. So you
I can tell you one joke, actually, if you don't mind. It's a short one. It's typical because it begins like hundreds of jokes from the Soviet times. So I think it was Chirac, Nixon and Putin were invited for the guided tour of the hell before settling there. And the guide takes them along the administrative building, along the corridor, and one of the doors is open, and there is a desk and a telephone, old-style telephone. And so they are walking, and suddenly Chirac notices the telephone and asks, is it possible to phone from here, Champs-Élysées? And the guide says, yes, of course, 5 million euros, and you can talk. I said, well, they will pay. So he goes, he speaks on the phone for 5 minutes, comes back, very happy. Nixon says, can I also phone White House? Yes, please, $5 million, and you go on. So he talks, and then Putin says, I can also call Kremlin. And the guy, yes, 20 kopecks. And both Chirac and Nixon are appalled. They say, why we are paying millions and he's paying kopecks? And the guy says, well, you are calling international lines and he is making a local call. This is one of the recent jokes.
That's fantastic. Okay, well, you were talking about your formative experiences and the atmosphere that you grew up in. I feel like you both have a strong sense of duty to your respective countries and maybe also a sense of mission and that you're sort of defending values that are under threat, values of tolerance and integrity and equality. So it's very obvious that you care deeply about what's happening in your societies. So I was wondering if there's any kind of Jonathan, in your life journey or childhood, you know, what made you this way? Can we make more people like this? Can you pin it down?
You know, it feels weird for me to be on a platform like this talking about politics and writing, really, because I'm in my daily life I'm not an especially political person. I mean, I don't join parties. I don't campaign. I'm not very active in my daily political life, and I'm kind of uneasy with this idea of writing, particularly novel writing, being used in this way. So it's not that I'm an especially political person, and it's not that I'm on a mission to change my country or change the world or whatever, because literature doesn't work like that. But I think, you know, in spite of all that, it was when I started dealing with contemporary politics in my books that I found my voice in a strange kind of way. And it happened with What a Carve Up, and it was largely to do with things that had nothing to do with politics, in fact. I mean, I felt angry and uneasy about a lot of the things that had happened in Britain during the Thatcher years, and so did my friends who were teachers and doctors and social workers and whatever. And you know, it was their stories largely that I wanted to tell in the book. And I realized that to tell this story, to tell the story of a whole decade and a whole political system and how it had or ideology and how it had changed my country, I was going to have to write something big and ambitious, and I'd never done that before. My first 3 books had been very short, almost minimalist, very personal, very, very focused on relationships and individual lives and so on. And suddenly I had to put all that aside and think about the novel completely differently. And just in terms of scale, I found myself writing a 500-page book instead of a 200-page book. But, I discovered at that moment, and would not have discovered it any other way, that actually this was the kind of book I knew how to write. I don't really know how to write short, personal books. I'd like to, because I enjoy reading those books myself. But, like some athletes are better at sprints than at marathons, I just found that I was better over a long distance, and better when I allowed myself a more panoramic and kind of socially engaged and inclusive perspective than I'd been using in my books up until that point.
In terms of the subject matter that you choose to write about, I mean, that's your choice of topics for both of you has been, in some of your books, a political choice. I'm thinking of the Rotters Club. We're very sympathetic with the striking workers in the 1970s, and there's a scene where the police charge the peaceful strikers and start attacking people and injuring them, and the writer has the power to make you care about the striker, or could make you feel sympathetic to the policeman if he or she chose to do so. So you can make anything sympathetic or anyone sympathetic and anything plausible, and the president of the president's last love is somehow sympathetic, despite having no moral compass and allowing bad things to happen to other people. Are we safe from authors abusing this power? Or do you think that it is obvious that authors are always going to be on this side of the oppressed? Andreï?
Well, first of all, I mean, I treat very often my so-called negative characters as hedgehogs or squirrels who are anyway natural and beautiful. So, I mean, I don't have a division between I like all of my characters. But now I lost your question. The last several words you said.
Can we take it for granted that the author will always be on the side of the oppressed?
No. I mean, there are authors, there are readers who are looking in the books the proof that life is beautiful, and there is sense to remain optimistic, and majority of writers are actually writing books for them. But there are also readers who are looking for proof that life is terrible. And then they read Michel Houellebecq, Céline, and some fewer writers who are delivering this message to them, just confirming that life is terrible, people are incredibly useless, etc. But I'm on the positive side because, I was born as a pathological optimist. So I mean, only once I had problem in the beginning of 90s when we had a real sort of mafia wars in Kiev, and the situation was dire, and a friend of mine asked me, because he was living for Germany, and he said, are you still crazy optimist, or you are now a normal pessimist as everybody else? And I said, no, I'm still an optimist, but now I am black optimist. And he asked, what does it mean? I said, well, black optimist knows that everything will be good in the end, but he is not sure he will survive to this moment. So I'm gray optimist now.
Okay. Well, it's interesting that you mention Michel Houellebecq, because I thought of his novels Submission, Soumission, which tells a story of a government in contemporary France which is dominated by an Islamist party, and they start making radical reforms. And it's a hell of a depressing book. And I wondered if, Jonathan, are there subjects which are too sensitive or too bleak to be satirized, or is there a danger of fictionalizing a scenario which would bring out the worst in people, or let's say feed the fears of the far right?
To go back to your previous question, first of all, about being on the side of the oppressed, I would struggle to understand the mentality of a writer who wanted to write. I'd struggle to understand why anyone wanted to write if they thought that the world was arranged correctly and everything was hunky-dory and things were as they should be. You know, one of the reasons for writing, as far as I'm concerned, is to rearrange reality into, you know, not always so that the good end happily and the bad end unhappily, or anything as pat as that, but, you know, to rearrange it in such a way that it's comprehensible and livable with and graspable and illuminates something about the real world. And, you know, just to go to the effort of shutting yourself away in a room and writing books, if you didn't have that desire to fundamentally, imaginatively readjust the way the world looks, that would be strange to me. So the whole idea of a conservative writer or a reactionary writer is, I mean, they exist obviously, but it's puzzling to me. It's puzzling to me, and they're exceptions, I think. As for whether there are things that you can't laugh about or can't write about, no, I don't think there are, and I don't think there should be. But I mean, Welbeck is a great provocateur and likes to get a strong reaction out of his readers and out of society generally. The way that I write, certainly, I can't speak for Andreï, is warmer and more genial and more sympathetic than that. And another of the attractions for writing for me is precisely to understand other people's point of view, to understand points of view which, you know, in my daily life I'm not at all sympathetic with or easily able to understand, and just to understand the world better. So it's a very personal motivation from that point of view. If, as a byproduct of that, you know, people read my books and I take them through the same kind of experience, the same kind of learning curve, then that's great.
And your latest book, Middle England, takes place against the backdrop of Brexit a few years before and then the time since. What struck me about the book is that it shows how many fault lines there are, you know, the great divisions in British society, which can come up, those lines can run through families, and there are so many different ways that people are divided in their hearts as well. Can you tell us a little bit, sort of by way of explanation for the phenomenon of Brexit, what are those divisions? What's the explanation for them?
Well, it's been called a Brexit novel, although I started thinking about it, which for me is the same thing as starting writing it, before the referendum. So I already knew that I wanted to take these particular characters who I'd written about in my earlier books and take them on a journey from around about 2010 was the date I settled on, so after the financial crisis, and bring them to the point we were at when I started thinking about the book, which is the beginning of 2016. Middle England is part of a trilogy with the Rotters Club and the Close Circle, but in my mind it's also part of a looser trilogy with my two previous books. I wrote a novel called Expo 58, which is set at the Brussels World's Fair of 1958, and I wrote it really as a piece of escapism and as a light-hearted comedy espionage book. But I realized after I'd written it that I'd actually written a book about British Euroscepticism. and about the always ambivalent, slightly ironic, slightly sneery British attitude towards the European project ever since it, started in the 1950s. I then wrote a book called Number 11, which is one of my more satirical books actually, but is not very funny. Because I decided that if I was going to write a satirical novel on this occasion, I didn't want to make the reader laugh, I wanted to make the reader feel repulsed. So it's a book which generically dabbles with horror fiction and sci-fi. And it's also a book about the David Cameron years, the coalition government years in Britain between, from 2010 and for 4 or 5 years after that. So it's a book about austerity and the way that big inequalities of wealth have become entrenched in British society. And to me, in a way, Middle England follows on logically from that, because yes, it became a Brexit novel, it became a novel about the referendum and why Britain voted the way that it did. But to me, it follows on logically from those 2 other books, which, to express it as a formula, would be Euroscepticism plus austerity equals Brexit, or leads to Brexit. And if you look at those 3 books together, that's the kind of trajectory they take. But the divisions, are not just in Britain at the moment, are not just economic, and not even primarily economic. I don't think they're cultural. They're about identity politics. They're about our sense of national identity, what kind of country we think we are, and the biggest and most painful divide, I think, in many ways at the moment, is between the generations, between older people and younger people. Because if you look at the people who are showing up to Nigel Farage's rallies at the moment in quite considerable numbers, not only are they all white, obviously, but they're usually 50 or above. And meanwhile, you have school kids and teenagers out on the streets campaigning about climate change, and we have 2 completely different ways of looking at the world. And the bitterness and the irony of Brexit, for me, is that it's an older generation fucking up the future of a younger generation without their say-so.
Mm-hmm. And speaking then of divisions, Ukraine is no stranger to that as well. How is the country, Andreï, managing to overcome this kind of open wound of its territory being compromised?
Well, probably I should explain a couple of small things about Ukraine, because thanks to the journalists, most foreign correspondents, most of whom live or work in Moscow and write about Ukraine, a lot of people in Europe don't understand Ukrainian problems and history of these problems. So, I mean, the main issue in Ukraine is not a division between Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers and then Hungarian speakers and Crimean Tatar speakers, no. Ukraine, most of the Ukraine was in the Soviet Union for 70 years, Western Ukraine was for 40 years. Western Ukraine kept its Ukrainian identity, and what I will probably begin with the difference between Russian mentality and Ukrainian mentality or identity, because Ukrainian mentality is based historically on the matrix of democratic anarchy of 14th, 15th century. When the Cossacks were ruling the territory, Ukraine was independent, but it was not really a state because they didn't produce their own money. They didn't have fixed borders, but they had elections of the leader of the Cossacks army, who was called Hetman, and they had a military legal system, military courts, but no civil courts. So, I mean, if you go into history, you find lots of incredible things about Ukraine. So, I mean, these people never lived, never had their own royals, kings or queens. I mean, the territory was taken sometimes by Poland, and they were under Polish crown. Then later they became under Russian crown. Russian mentality is based, actually, it's collective, and it is based on the metrics of the monarchy from the early ages. So for Russians, it's natural to love their king, and when they are fed up with him, to kill him and to love the next one. Ukrainians, actually, also from the 15th, 14th century, when they were electing the hetman, the head of the army, who was head of the state, they were practically electing him to hate him and then to try to replace him at once. So they were always individuals. Everyone had his own opinion, and even today, out of 40 million Ukrainians who live in Ukraine, I mean, you will find out that there are 40 million images of future Ukraine existing. In Russia, it's one image of future great Russian empire. Everybody agrees with it. So in the Soviet times, and even before the Soviet times, the collective mentality from Russia moved towards West. And actually, a lot of ethnic Ukrainians became bearers of Russian mentality, royalists or monarchies, or were trying to make career in Russian empire, and some of them succeeded. But at the same time, when Ukraine became independent, the individualism fought back. And the border between collective and Eastern and individual Western mentality started moving towards the East, towards the border with Russia. And if we didn't have the conflict, the war in Donbass and annexation of Crimea in 15 years' time, the border between two mentalities would finally coincide with the border between Russia and Ukraine. And I think Putin was very afraid that that can happen, because at least half of Russian speakers in Ukraine, they are pro-European, they are individualists. They are not sort of the owners of the Russian collective mentalities. But I mean, Russia is using Russian language as an instrument to consolidate pro-Russian feelings among the Russians. Russia, or ethnic Russians, not only ethnic Russians, because there are lots of Ukrainians who are Russian speakers. Because actually in the Soviet times, if you wanted to make a career anywhere, you had to forget your Ukrainian language and start speaking Russian, because this was the official state language, yeah. And so today, I mean, I divide actually Russian speakers into two different groups. The Soviet speakers, instead of Russian, that's the representatives of the collective Soviet mentality, which became Russian mentality. And then ethnic Russians, or Russian minority, who are actually understanding their roots, understanding their culture, but they are not bearers of, they are not responsible for what is Russia doing to Ukraine. And of course, in this sense, you have to respect their language, as well as you have to respect the languages of all the 26 minorities of Ukraine.
And meanwhile, the economy is paralyzed to an extent. And I want to ask about the young people.
The economy is not paralyzed. The economy is, they say, I don't know who, the economy is booming. I mean, people are becoming much better off. And people, I mean, who live in Kiev, for example, I mean, they can live ignoring the war in the East. It's incredible. I mean, if you try to travel from Ukraine, it's you have to stand sometimes 40 minutes in the queue to at the passport control in the airport. I mean, everybody is having holidays in Tunisia, in Italy, in France. I mean, half of the country is on holiday. Everybody has a car in the village. I mean, there is no poverty. I mean, there is no economical crisis, except, of course, for the territories along the front line. And you should understand that the front line is 450 kilometers long. And the gray zone, it's actually the topic of my latest book, which will be out in French and English in 2020. There are dozens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people living in the gray zone between military positions of separatists and Russian volunteers and Ukrainian army. And actually, and if you go to the frontline zone, I mean, like I went, as I said, to a town, Stanica Luganska, next to Lugansk. So actually, you stand on one side of the river, small river, and on the other side, you have separatist territories supported by Russians, financed by Russians, but people from there are coming every day officially to this town to pick up their Ukrainian pensions, to buy the products because the food is much better quality there than, and going back. So in this situation, you have locals who are also, both sides are Russian speakers, but the locals hate now their compatriots from the other side who live under separatists, because the locals cannot get access to bank machines to pick up their salaries. They have to take buses 50 kilometers inland to another town to get money from the bank machine. And in this situation, I mean...
It's very dysfunctional.
Well, it is dysfunctional, but I mean, these are real divisions. I mean, the real divisions are usually economical, let's say.
I wanted to bring in a little bit of a few thoughts about well, fake news, lies in politics, but maybe we'll park that for now, because I think it might be good to hear some questions from the audience, and if we run out of questions, then we'll talk about the fact that Trump has made 10,000 false or misleading claims in his presidency, and even though teams of people, fact checkers, you know, they challenge all of these things, it doesn't make a difference. So do we have a question, gentleman at the back?
Yes, I will try in English. So I wanted to come to the point at the beginning where you were speaking about these comedians in politics, especially in your country, in Ukraine. And I come from a country where we had a comedian, I think the best ever, for 25 years. It's Italy, and I was interested in your comment when you said that the people electing this kind of persons are then the ones that look television or reality shows or whatever, and not really read books. And you said that you write for the people reading books and not to the ones looking at television. But that's the point. I mean, do you have any plans or ideas or magic solution to access those people? Because that's the problem. If you can extend your words to the people that normally do not read books, but that could be hopefully one day accessed. And I think it's your role as writers to try that. And this obviously it's applicable to both. So what do you think about? And another little comment, last one, it's I mean, the problem in the countries also like Italy, it's that you have those people, this populism, these comedians that raise because the alternative is very weak. It's really weak, and normally mentally weak people, they unite very well, but the ones that have good ideas, they are constantly divided, and so they don't access the majority at the end. So the lack of alternative is also a problem. So yes, if you can comment on this, thanks.
Well, you are right, but yeah, I mean, in Ukraine situation, like in Italian situation, TV viewers elected TV president. In Ukraine, younger people, even those who are 30 years old, I mean, they don't watch so much television. They are watching YouTube or checking what they want to watch online, and they are reading more. To access the older generation is very difficult because, I mean, these people think very often that their literature is left behind in the Soviet times. They don't accept today's culture, today's literature. So it will take time before the influence of internet will catch up with the influence of television. But generally, I mean, you are right, there is no trust into politicians in Ukraine. So the whole story which ended up with electing Zelensky as the Ukrainian president began 30 years ago with Berlusconi. Only Berlusconi was the owner of the TV channel, so he used the instrument to make himself a president. And here the TV channel, one of the two biggest TV channels in Ukraine, is owned by another oligarch who is personal enemy of now ex-president Petro Poroshenko. So it was also part, I see it as a revenge, but also his TV channel created virtual president. And I think in the future, if situation doesn't change, we will have to elect or to choose between two TV presidents. So the two main TV channels will be competing with each other for their president. That's my sort of vision.
Yeah, no obvious magic formula.
No, I don't see magic formula in the next for the next 5 years or 10 years.
What about you, Jonathan? Did you want to come in?
Well, I would just say that that Brexit also is the creation of comedy, in a way. It's an interesting phenomenon. We also have Beppe Grillo in Italy, transforming the political landscape there, and we have what is happening in Ukraine. But Boris Johnson, I don't normally manage to get through one of these events without talking about Boris Johnson, and sure enough, he's sneaked in at the last minute. Is also a comedian in some ways. I mean, he began as a journalist reporting from Brussels, and because he has the kind of mind, a very typically English mind, actually, which finds detail boring and practicality boring, he got sick of, writing what he thought were these very dull dispatches from Brussels about European food regulations and so on, and started to treat the whole of the European Union as a joke. And his reports from Brussels became more and more comic and satirical. And the other newspapers picked up on this and started to get their own correspondents to write in the same vein. And that was how, the European Union in Britain became actually what is the most dangerous thing of all for it to become to the British people, which is a joke. And we started to think it was all about people telling us that we couldn't have bendy bananas anymore, and the Brussels bureaucrats imposing these absurd regulations on us. The great irony is that Boris Johnson then moved from journalism into politics, became a very prominent conservative political figure in Britain in the last few years. And then, began to campaign for Brexit and against the European Union. But what he was campaigning against, the vision of the European Union that he was trying to turn the British people off, was the one he created himself. It was his own satirical joke version of what the European Union is. The British pride themselves on their sense of humour, but our sense of humour and our unwillingness to look at some things in the face seriously has been one of our downfalls in the last few years.
And Boris Johnson is now a front runner to be the next Prime Minister.
Could very easily be Prime Minister in a couple of months' time, yeah.
Yeah, my heart sinks for Ireland as well.
Yeah, you will have a lot to laugh about.
So do we have time for, I'd say, one more question. In the front row, there's a gentleman in blue. One question.
I was wondering about the way you write satire. Can you actually write satire only being on one side of things? And would a true satirist, I would say, avoid writing satire about also because the way you said it is revealing. I mean, you said, Andreï, that you are actually comforting the people that already are convinced of your views. So, would it not be wiser and wittier to actually make satire also about the opponents? I mean, we're talking about the weakness of the opponents. Could you also write satire about the people that are actually against the system and that cannot make it to get things changed?
It is very easy. I can.
But do you do it?
Yeah, I think I do it because I don't have my own political party. I don't have political groups that I support. I support individuals when I agree with them. And if they change, I start criticizing them. I write a lot of columns and articles and essays for the media. But generally, I'm not fighter or defender of one side. But generally, I think a writer, especially in post-Soviet space, shouldn't ally with the groups. He should remain independent and should remain critical, whoever comes into power.
Yeah, this is, I mean, this is one of my problems with satire, that very often, particularly in the UK actually, it can reduce itself to preaching to the converted. And in a way there's nothing wrong with that. It's very nice to get together with a whole lot of like-minded people and have a laugh about something, but you don't effect change in that way at all. So, you know, the greatest work of satire for me is Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, and the last book of Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, where Swift asks us to look humanity in the face and decide whether we are animal creatures or rational creatures. And it's a deeply, profoundly uncomfortable question, and one which he doesn't provide an answer to. And for me, I always try to remember that the greatest satire is often ambiguous and not particularly funny. So just because someone is making a political joke doesn't make it satire, in my opinion.
I think that's all we have time for now, today. It's been a fantastic discussion. I think we could have gone on for another hour, but maybe you'll have one-to-one time with the authors, because after this they're going to go upstairs to the bookshop where they'll be signing their books, and that's on the second floor or 2 floors above us here. Maybe yeah, you can join me in appreciating Andreï Kourkov and Jonathan Coe.